A Soviet surgeon lay on the operating table, but there was no other doctor, no nurse, no anesthesia, only a mirror, a scalpel, and his own trembling hands. His name was Dr. Leonid Rogozov. He was trapped in Antarctica, the only doctor among dozens of men. When fever struck, when his stomach swelled with unbearable pain, he knew the truth. His appendix was going to kill him. No plane could reach him. No ship could break through the ice. If he did nothing, he was dead within days. If he tried the unthinkable, he might live. So he disinfected his tools, sat in silence, and then with the camera rolling to prove he was not insane, he sliced into his own flesh. Blood blurred his vision. His body shook. He cut deeper, searching blindly for the organ that was poisoning him. But here is the question history still struggles with. Was this an act of pure survival, or the madness of a man willing to dissect himself to cheat death? Antarctica, 1961. The Novolazarevskaya research station stood like a metal box in the endless snow. Inside, a small team of Soviet scientists and workers endured months of isolation. Their only doctor was Leonid Rogozov, just 27 years old. Young, serious, but already seasoned in medicine. He had trained in surgery. He had studied infection. He knew the fragility of the human body. What he did not know was that soon his own body would become the battlefield. It began as a dull ache in his right side, then fever, nausea, the swelling of the abdomen. Rogozov recognized the symptoms instantly. Acute appendicitis. Left untreated, the appendix bursts, flooding the body with infection. Death follows swiftly. He had diagnosed others before. This time, he was diagnosing himself. The situation was grim. Antarctica was locked in. Planes could not fly through the winter storms. Ships could not break through the ice. The Soviet government, thousands of miles away, could only send messages of support. They could not send help. If nothing was done, Rogozov would die, and the station would be left without its only physician. He tried conservative treatment at first, antibiotics, rest, but the pain worsened. His fever climbed. Each hour became more dangerous. By the fourth day, he knew the infection was spreading. Waiting meant certain death. The only option left was the unthinkable, performing an appendectomy on himself. The men at the station reacted with disbelief. A man cannot operate on his own abdomen. The pain would be unbearable. The angles would be wrong. One slip of the hand could cut an artery, sever an organ, end everything in seconds. But Rogozov was resolute. If no one tried, there was no chance at all. If he tried, perhaps he would live. He prepared as if his patient were anyone else. He sterilized the room. He laid out scalpels, retractors, sponges. He recruited 2 assistants, not doctors, just ordinary station members. One would hand him instruments. The other would hold the mirror so he could see the incision. They were terrified, but they obeyed. Rogozov explained the plan with cold precision. If he lost too much blood, they must keep him conscious. If he passed out, they must inject adrenaline. If his heart stopped, they must attempt resuscitation. He gave these orders not as a patient, but as a commander preparing for battle. Then he lay on the table, disinfected his own skin, and took the scalpel. When the first cut opened his abdomen, the assistants almost fainted. Blood welled up, and Rogozov gritted his teeth. He could not see clearly in the mirror. Everything was reversed. He had to work largely by feel, blindly probing inside his own body. His breathing quickened. Sweat stung his eyes, and the pain drove him near collapse. Yet he continued. Every move had to be perfect. He tied off tissue. He retracted the layers of muscle. His hands shook, but he steadied it against the edge of the wound. The assistants grew pale, one nearly dropping the lamp. Rogozov barked orders through clenched teeth. He was both surgeon and patient, both commander and victim. For over an hour he worked, cutting deeper, locating the swollen appendix. His face turned ashen, and at times he nearly lost consciousness. But then, at last, he touched what he had been searching for, the infected organ, dangerously close to bursting. With trembling fingers, he excised it. When it was over, he stitched the wound himself. His strength was gone, but he forced the needle through flesh, sealing the cut he had made. He leaned back, soaked in blood, instruments scattered, and then he survived. It was impossible. A human being had done surgery on himself in the most remote corner of the earth. And to prove he had not gone insane, to silence any doubt, the assistants filmed the procedure. The Soviet Union would later circulate the footage as proof of both medical courage and human endurance. But beneath the celebration lay a darker question. Did Rogozov's survival mark a triumph of will? Or did it prove that desperation can drive a man to mutilate himself beyond the edge of reason? The room smelled of antiseptic and fear. 2 assistants, trembling in their wool coats, stood at either side of the narrow table. Their hands shook so badly that Rogozov snapped at them. Short, sharp commands, his voice strained with pain, but cutting through the panic. He was no longer just their colleague. In that moment, He was their commander, and the war was against his own dying body. He pressed the scalpel into his skin again, feeling the sting, watching as the blade parted his own flesh. The assistants looked away, but he barked at them again. They had to watch. If they faltered, he would die. A mirror had been set up so he could see, but the reversed image twisted everything. He tried once, twice, then abandoned it. The mirror was disorienting. He would have to operate blind, guided only by touch. His gloves slipped in the blood, so he tore them off. Bare hands inside his own body. He probed through layers of fat and muscle, every motion sending fire through his nerves. He gasped, sweat rolling down his forehead, but he did not stop. He clenched the forceps, pulling tissue aside, searching. Time dissolved into agony. Minutes stretched like hours. At one point, he almost fainted. The assistants froze, thinking it was over. But then, with a guttural growl, he pulled himself back, gasping for air. He ordered one of them to dab his forehead with gauze. His lips were pale, his eyes glassy, but his mind remained sharp. At last, after an eternity of probing, his fingers brushed something swollen, hard, and hot inside him. The appendix, inflamed, on the verge of rupture. His breathing slowed. This was the critical moment. One slip of the scalpel could flood his abdomen with infection and kill him within hours. He steadied his trembling hand and began to cut. The assistants were close to collapse. One nearly dropped the lamp, plunging the table into shadow. Rogozov cursed at him, the words raw and furious. The man steadied the light again, his eyes wide, his knuckles white from gripping the handle. The other assistant tried not to gag as Rogozov pulled out the infected organ, holding it up for them to see. It was done. He had excised his own appendix, but his ordeal was far from over. With shaking hands, nearly delirious from blood loss, he stitched himself shut. Each stitch dragged the needle through his own skin, each knot tied while his vision swam. Still, he worked with the precision of a surgeon, refusing to leave the wound raw. The camera recorded it all. The footage was grainy, but the Soviet authorities would later use it as proof. Proof that the impossible had been done. Proof that man, when cornered, could transcend pain, fear, even sanity. When Rogozov finished, he lay back, exhausted, soaked in sweat, his abdomen stitched, the appendix lying in a dish. He whispered a final instruction to sterilize the instruments. Then he closed his eyes. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to drift toward unconsciousness. But here is where the story turns darker. Because survival was not guaranteed. Even after removing the organ, infection could spread. He could still die in the following days. In the footage, those reels of a man cutting into his own flesh would haunt those who watched them. The assistants, decades later, could not forget the sound of his ragged breathing, the sight of his hands vanishing into his own abdomen. And so the question lingered, was this the greatest act of human endurance, or the darkest example of how isolation can drive a man beyond the limits of what should be possible? When Rogozov opened his eyes, he was not in a hospital bed. He was still in the crude operating room, half conscious, his assistants hovering over him, terrified to touch him, terrified to move. For hours they waited, unsure if their surgeon, who had just cut himself open, would ever rise again. His lips were cracked, his pulse weak, his skin ghostly pale, but his chest still lifted. He was alive. The next day, he forced himself to walk, slow, agonizing steps across the frozen outpost. Each movement tugged at the stitches. Each breath reminded him of what he had endured. His colleagues begged him to rest. He refused. He knew infection was still possible, perhaps inevitable. He checked his own wound, inspected the swelling, monitored his own fever. He became both patient and doctor, caught in a feedback loop of pain and science. On the 5th day, his fever broke. The wound closed. The experiment, if it could be called that, had succeeded. But there was no celebration. No one laughed. No one toasted. The silence in the station was heavy, like the weight of something forbidden. They had all witnessed a man take a scalpel to his own flesh and survive. It was more than survival. It was defiance of human limits. It was unnatural. When word reached Moscow, the Soviet state seized the story. Newspapers wrote of his triumph, framing him as the ultimate example of socialist strength, a man who conquered death through discipline, training, and sheer will. They called him a hero. They did not publish the photographs that showed the raw agony on his face, the sweat pooling on the floor, the horror in his assistant's eyes. The official story was clean, sanitized. The truth was not. Behind closed doors, doctors across the USSR watched the footage. Some whispered in awe. Others recoiled. A surgeon operating on himself was not just unthinkable. It was grotesque, a violation of medicine's sacred rules. Surgery was supposed to be 2 roles, healer and healed. Rogozov had collapsed those roles into one, creating something that unsettled even the most hardened physicians. And yet the propaganda machine had its uses. Rogozov's act became a story told in medical schools, in military briefings, in whispered tones. If one man could do this, what excuse did anyone else have for weakness? His image, pale and gaunt, became a weapon. The footage was not just proof of survival, it was proof of control, proof that the human body could be forced beyond reason. But survival left scars that no newspaper mentioned. Rogozov lived, yes. He returned home, yes. But his eyes had seen too much. He never spoke of the surgery with ease. In interviews, he was clinical, detached, but his colleagues noticed the shadows in his voice. His assistants never spoke publicly at all. What they had seen was too much, too grotesque to translate into words. And there was something darker. For in surviving, Rogozov had proven that man could be both victim and executioner of his own body. He had proven that under the right pressure, under the weight of isolation, even the boundary between self-preservation and self-destruction could vanish. His story was framed as triumph, but in its silence lurked a question. Was he brave or broken? Years later, the tape of the operation resurfaced. Young doctors watched it in disbelief. Some felt inspired, others felt ill. The camera had no mercy. It recorded every cut, every tremor, every gasp. Watching it was like watching humanity stripped bare, forced to stare at its own fragile machinery. And yet, in the cold logic of survival, what choice did he have? To wait was to die. To act was to descend into madness, but live. And so he chose the knife. He chose pain. He chose to prove that the line between sanity and desperation was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. The world called him a hero, but those who looked closer saw something else. They saw the face of a man who had crossed into a place no human was meant to go and returned alive. They saw the cost etched in his eyes, in the silence that followed him for the rest of his life. And still, the question lingered. Was this the ultimate act of courage, or a glimpse into the abyss of what happens when human beings are pushed past every natural limit? For the rest of his life, Leonid Rogozov carried the title the state had given him: hero, symbol, proof of Soviet resolve. But titles do not silence memory. Behind closed doors, when the applause was gone, he was still the man who had watched his own hand disappear inside his stomach. He returned to his career in medicine. He taught, he operated, he published papers. To colleagues, he was disciplined, methodical, brilliant. But those who worked closely with him said he had a presence that was difficult to name. He was calm, too calm, as if the normal boundaries of fear had been permanently burned out of him. Students asked him about that night in Antarctica. Sometimes he would answer clinically, describing the procedure as if he were discussing an ordinary case. Other times he would fall into silence, staring at nothing, lost in a place no one else could follow. It was as though two men lived in him, the doctor who had done his duty and the patient who had been carved open by his own hands. The Soviet Union loved the first man, but Rogozov lived with the second. He never claimed glory. He never indulged the state's propaganda. In rare moments of candor, he admitted that the operation had left him marked forever. His body healed, but his mind bore the memory of every slice, every tremor, every wave of pain he could not escape. He told one colleague that he felt as though he had watched himself die and be born again in the same night. The truth was simpler and darker. He had survived, but at the cost of proving something terrifying, that under pressure, a human could become both butcher and savior, victim and executioner. He had not only cheated death, he had dismantled the illusion of safety that medicine itself was built on. What haunted him was not the scar on his abdomen. It was the memory of his own trembling hand, and the knowledge that if the infection had spread even a little faster, even a few hours further, he would have cut himself open in vain. History framed him as an icon. But privately, Rogozov lived with the shadow of a question no one dared to ask him. What happens to a man who has seen his own insides, felt his body not as a vessel, but as a problem to be solved? Does he ever come back whole? Or does part of him remain forever on that table in Antarctica, staring into the mirror, scalpel in hand, watching himself break the laws of survival? After Antarctica, Leonid Rogozov's story spread like wildfire. Soviet newspapers framed it as proof that socialism forged unbreakable men, men capable of facing death without flinching. Posters carried his image. School children learned his name. He was made into something larger than human, an emblem of courage designed to outlast him. But myths rarely tell the full story. Outside the Soviet Union, Western doctors debated the operation with disbelief. Some argued it was reckless, a desperate gamble glorified into heroism. Others saw it as the ultimate act of medical discipline, proof of what human beings were capable of when trapped between death and survival. The more people argued, the less Rogozov himself seemed to matter. He became an icon, stripped of weakness, stripped of the shaking, sweating, terrified man who had bent over a mirror with his own stomach open. Over time, the tale grew darker in retellings. Some insisted he had not merely performed the surgery, but done so coldly, clinically, as if cutting into someone else's body. Others whispered that he had gone mad in Antarctica, that the operation had broken his mind and left him hollow. In reality, he was neither saint nor lunatic. He was a man forced into an impossible corner, one whose choice to survive became everyone else's story to own. What lingers is not the scar, not the stitches, but the image. The doctor in the mirror, hunched over his own body, proving that a human could both suffer and command, bleed and heal in the same breath. It is this image that haunted medicine, that haunted history. It is an image that unsettles us because it leaves no room for distance. We are forced to admit, if trapped, if abandoned, if pressed to the edge of extinction, we too might take the blade into our own hands. That is why Rogozov's act survived beyond the man himself. It became more than a story of surgery. It became a mirror, forcing every listener, every student, every passerby who read his name to wonder, what would I have done staring into my reflection, knowing no one could save me? And perhaps that is the true reason the story was repeated, reshaped, mythologized. It was not about a doctor in Antarctica. It was about us, about how thin the line really is between healer and destroyer, sanity and desperation, survival and surrender. A line so thin, one man crossed it and left the rest of the world forever staring at the scar he left behind. A man alone, a mirror, a scalpel pressed into his own flesh. That is where the story began. It ends perhaps not with the survival of Dr. Leonid Rogozov, but with the silence his act left behind. History loves survival stories. They are easy to tell. They are victories, wrapped in pain, but sealed with triumph. But this story resists that neatness. It is not a tale of glory. It is the image of a surgeon reduced to his most primitive instinct. Tear the poison out or be swallowed by it. That image does not inspire comfort. It unsettles because it is not about him. It is about us. Think about it. A trained doctor in one of the most controlled environments on Earth, the Soviet Antarctic station, was forced into an act that belongs more to nightmares than science. He was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. He had all the knowledge in the world, yet no one to use it on but himself. His hands shook, his blood fell. He stitched his own body shut. And still, the world called it triumph. But was it? Or was it a glimpse of something darker? The truth that, in the end, survival does not care about dignity or sanity or the boundaries we think divide civilized life from savagery. Stripped down to the edge of extinction, the doctor became both patient and surgeon, victim and savior, predator and prey. He blurred the roles so deeply that even he could no longer escape the mirror in front of him. That mirror is still there, not in Antarctica, not locked in Soviet archives, but in us. In the possibility that one day, faced with our own corner, our own impossible choice, we too will have to cross the same line, to cut into what we love, what we are, in order to live one more day. And here is the thought that lingers, that will not leave you when the story ends. The scar on Rogozov's stomach was not only proof that he lived, it was proof that human beings can become their own instruments, their own tormentors, their own salvation. So ask yourself, if it were you, trapped in the cold, no help coming, death already whispering in your gut, would you have the courage to hold the blade? Or would you let the silence take you first? Because in that mirror, the surgeon's eyes are not just his, they are yours, and the scar does not belong to him alone.